Hey everybody, KC here. So a few weeks ago when I was in Monterey doing a keynote with Jim Donald at the Organic Produce Summit, we were preceded by a writer named Larissa Zimberoff. And Larissa has written a book called Technically Food, Inside Silicon Valley's Mission to Change What We Eat. And this is a really, really interesting book talking about how a variety of startup companies are trying to come up with alternative foods funded to a great degree by millions and millions of dollars of the money coming from the venture capital business. This is what she calls new food, which is different than big food, although it might not be long term because let's face it, venture capital groups don't want to just make a little bit of money on their investments. They want to make a lot of money, and you make a lot of money by selling to big companies. But it's a really interesting book that raises what I think are a lot of existential questions about what we eat, how we think about what we eat, and sustainability, nutrition questions. It's a really fascinating book. Quite frankly, and I think Larissa would admit this, it probably asks more questions than it creates answers, but that's because we're still in the beginning stages. But I think it's really interesting. I recommend that you get the book, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Larissa Zimberoff. Well, Larissa Zimberoff, welcome to Morning Newsbeat.
Thank you, Kevin.
Oh, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. So explain to me, just take me back to the beginning when you sort of conceived of this book. What was the core question that in the back of your mind that you wanted to get answered?
The base of what I wanted to know was, is this healthy for me? And the reason I
Define that, I'm going to stop you. Define this. When you say this, what do you mean?
So my book is about what I called new foods. And these new foods encompass algae, mycelium, cultured dairy. This means that you're making proteins that come from a cow, but without the cow. Cultured meat, the same thing goes. It's beef, but without beef cells, without the cow. Vertical farms, which means you're growing indoors without the sun and without soil. And upcycled foods, which means you're reusing waste from another company to create something new. So I looked at all these foods and I was excited, but I wanted to know, were they healthy for me? And the reason, Kevin, is because I have type 1 diabetes. And in my book, in my introduction, I go into this. I talk about having diabetes as being my superpower. I see through food. I look at food as the macronutrients that are included in them. I see the carbohydrates, I see the protein, I see the fat, I see fiber. And these things make a difference on how I live my daily life. And because of that, once I saw things being recreated in the labs, I thought, are these still the same for me? Because processed foods and packaged foods that are delicious but come in crinkly bags and are, made with lots of sugar, fat, and salt, they're not good for me. They make things difficult. And so I wanted to know more.
Yeah, and and let me make sure I hold up the book because I think that's very important, and I will put a link to where you can get the book at the bottom of the story. It's interesting when you talk about processed foods. It's not. I mean, it's interesting because in so many ways what you're talking about here sound like, and disabuse me of this notion if I'm wrong, but they sound like they're genetically engineered in some ways, or it's closer to being genetically engineered foods. And there's a lot of suspicion within some parts of the food industry about that. So are they being engineered? I mean, explain that a little bit.
Yeah, there is a lot to explain, which is why I wrote the book. So there is genetic engineering going on. There are yeasts and bacteria that are being what I call programmed to spit out proteins. For example, whey protein, which comes from cow's milk. Whey and casein protein are two of the most important proteins found in cow's milk. And it's what people formulate with yogurt, ice cream, all our favorite things, sour cream, whipped cream. So these bacteria, these flora will spit out proteins that are identical to what the cow produces, but not using a cow. Now, the yeast itself is genetically engineered. but what's spit out is no longer considered genetically engineered.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really complicated question. And a lot of education will have to happen for these foods to come to market and to be successful. Will a vegan eat something that includes whey protein? Maybe. I don't know. If it's not coming from the cow, but it originated with the cow, will they eat it? And so there's a lot of big questions. And there is a lot of genetic engineering, but the final product isn't considered genetically engineered.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it does get into an area that's it's very complex, and in some ways it seems to cross the boundaries a little bit, right? Because you have people who are very concerned about health, who are very concerned about and not only their health but the health of the planet, sustainability, all those sorts of things. But they would tend to define some of what's going on here as being frankenfoods, and yet you've got this whole category would speak to their desire for health and the health of the planet. And I mean, to me, when I'm reading the book, I'm thinking this is going to create a lot of existential questions for a lot of people.
Definitely.
Because the book is written as sort of your learning experience. I mean, that's the story you're telling. Did you sort of sense that going along, that this is not this is not going to be a book that was going to come out with black and white answers? Yes, we should do this. Yes, or no, we shouldn't do that. But was rather going to create a lot of issues that may require a sequel or two.
There are definitely a lot of questions in my book, and not everyone likes those. There's an Amazon reviewer who's very unhappy with all my questions, but they're in there to show you that the founders aren't quite ready to tell us everything we want to know, and they're not even ready to tell me. Like I'll be like, well, just tell me off the record, right? And I can't always get it, even when I promise them that. So I wanted this book to make us ask questions. Right. I wanted this book because it's so early in these, what I call new foods, because it's so early in their origin status. I wanted us to ask more questions. I wanted to put a spotlight on them. I wanted to bring it to the forefront.
Well, and it's interesting when you talk about there's going to be a lot of education that's going to be required. One of the things, and God, I've been writing about this for 20 plus years. One of the things that I've always thought the industry should do more of, the food industry, is sort of be transparent with information, right? Be willing to tell customers what's in a product, and quite frankly, if it's genetically engineered, make the case for it, right? Don't run away from it. Don't say, oh, that'll just scare them. Make the case. Why is that a good thing? And Absolutely. But there's a lot of resistance. I mean, even in genetically, most people don't even, not most people, but a lot of people in the industry don't even want a product to be labeled if it has GMOs in it. And so what you're describing is something that even needs more education, needs even more explanation, and needs to have a clear narrative put together. And yet, that's not necessarily something that comes easy to this industry.
It doesn't come easy to the industry now, right? Just like, as you said, I might ask a company like who their co-packer is or their co-man is, and they don't want to tell me. Right. I just think it's so simple. I don't understand. I still don't understand, even though people have explained to me why. If I ask them about their ingredients, they might say, oh, well, they order them for me, right? So, I mean, our supply chain has become more transparent. We can put QR codes on everything. We can put provenance on everything. We really, with Michael Pollan and Dan Barber, the chef Dan Barber, we really thought we were getting, in the slow food movement, I really thought we were getting more transparency, like farm to table. People were really embracing it. Organics is on the rise, right? People are buying more organics, but yet we're still getting shrouded in secrecy. Today, with these new startups that are in my book, their secrecy comes from having IP, having proprietary ways that they're doing things that they can't share. They get investment money because they have this technology. And so I wrote the book to get as far as I could, knowing I wasn't going to get to the finish line.
Well, it's also interesting because you're basically immersing yourself in two very different cultures, right? You're immersing yourself in sort of that startup culture that's focused on the science, but you're also immersing yourself in the venture capital culture, which is all about money. And I think that, around here, we like to refer to it as, there's always the Jurassic Park question, right? Just because you can do something, should you do something? And I think that's, again, that's one of the existential questions, it seems to me, that people are going to have to deal with in terms of this particular subject going forward.
Absolutely. These companies right now, they're mission-based. Their biggest goal is to help solve climate problems. And we don't know if they're solutions, right? They're these sort of like one node technology solutions, right? They're very vertical. They're just thinking about their one little puzzle piece versus the whole landscape of what's happening. They're just like, we're gonna recreate meat so that you can still eat meat, and by doing that, we will stop climate change. Yeah. Without looking at like maybe our American diet, which is really built upon some bad conclusions, right? Processed food, packaged food, convenience, food for convenience, right? We are learning that these aren't good for us, but yet we still have them because they make them so delicious, and people they don't want to go out of their way. So if these new foods are built on this same kind of American industrialized diet, where are we? We're not anywhere new. And so they haven't actually solved anything if none of us are healthy.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you make the point about people saying, like, if you can move away from cows, it's better for the environment. But there's somebody in the book, and I can't remember the exact example, where guys, no, I think cows can be part of the solution. So you've got different, you already have a little bit of people defending their own turf, depending on where they happen to be.
Oh yeah, there are people fighting over naming, right? So like the cattle industry is fighting over, whether or not cultured meat can use the word meat. There's the dairy industry is fighting over whether people can use the word butter. And they're just trying to protect their turf. And so unless we like sort of kumbaya come together to like really make change that is focused on the planet and our health, we're not going to get very far.
I'm way more cynical. I don't believe in kumbaya anymore. But let me ask you, that's a really interesting question, because that was one of the things that really stuck out to me in the book, was you were talking about there's a non-meat product called Meati, MEATI. There's Just Egg, which has no egg in it. There's Just Mayo, which has no mayo in it, which has no egg in it. Where do you come down on that? Having gone through this whole process, do you think something without eggs should be able to be called an egg, or do you think something without meat should be able to be called a meat? How do you?
I think it's okay as long as it's clearly labeled what it's made from. So on the Just Egg example, it says Just Egg, and in tiny letters at the very, very top, it says made from plants.
Right.
But it does come in a plastic bottle. You kind of know it's certainly not an egg in a shell. So, consumers do pretty much know what they're looking for. But I do think that labeling needs to be better as far as what the ingredients are, or how it's made, or what it's made from. I don't think I can imagine a future where we had cultured meat, a steak that was called, if it's a steak, I can't see it being called a flaky monkey, I don't know, just a made up word.
Well, you can have a swordfish steak, and nobody argues that, because it's still a swordfish steak.
Right. So it's like, it's a broccoli, it's a mung bean egg.
Yeah. The problem to me isn't the word steak. The problem is the word meat. And you and I might disagree on this one. I've like, for example, I totally respect when the people from Parma say, no, you can't call it Parma ham, and if it's not from Parma. I think that's an entirely fair, or you can't call it champagne if it's not from France. That seems to be to me to be an entirely fair distinction to make, and they have their, and I can understand why they're defensive about that.
Are you just as protective of the word butter or milk? No, I see you're not. I can see it.
I am conflicted on that one. But I have to say, I don't know what the other word is. Does oat beverage bother me? Does that both would I be less likely to drink oat beverage as opposed to oat milk? I don't think it would bother me. But if you had oatmeal that was made, if they advertised something as being oatmeal and it wasn't made from oats, I would feel deceived.
What about
We're gonna go down this road, huh? Okay.
What about mother's milk, right? Which is what we're supposed to drink.
Only
Okay.
till a certain age, but okay.
It's the only mammalian milk we're supposed to eat. We're supposed to drink, right? That's called milk. And now we've taken that word and given it to cows, which isn't a human need.
While I'm switching genders here, is I think mother's milk can be grandfathered in simply because it existed before the other kind of milk did.
Well, my point is that maybe it should only be applied to mother's milk, right? And so once it was used for cow's milk, it opened the floodgates to it being used anywhere else. And it's being used on soy milk for decades.
True.
So, and if meat means protein, then you know, as long as there's,
I don't think of meat as being, I don't think of meat as meat equals protein. I don't think of those as being synonyms, but maybe I'm wrong. And that's a totally subjective reaction to it. I actually, at the end of the day, I don't care that much as long as things are clearly labeled.
Yeah.
And I think milk, if it's not milk, or if they say just egg, and just egg is in letters this big, and then it's made from plants, it's in letters this big, that strikes me as being willfully deceptive.
Yeah, agreed.
Oh, okay.
Agreed. Yeah, I think a clearer labeling with equal property to sizing.
Right. But I think, and to me, the kind of broader point, and this, I kept being reminded of this almost on every page, is that this is a complicated story that suppliers and retailers are going to figure out how to tell, right? That it's not like, okay, put it in a box, put it in a bottle or whatever, and put it on the shelf and it'll just go. That would be the completely wrong approach to take. They've got to figure out what their story and what their narrative is, and be persuasive about it. I mean, that's the process.
They're doing it because they're all trying to get media to write about them.
Right.
So it's part of what they're doing, right? Investors, they get investment money, investors push them to get stories out. The stories come out and start normalizing what they're doing.
Except they're not telling you, as you said, they're not telling you everything. They're not. Transparency only goes to the point where they think somebody's going to write them a check or put them in the Wall Street Journal or on Bloomberg, right? And once they get to that point, the transparency evaporates.
Well, yeah, they speak to a certain extent.
Right.
And then when they serve, like Eat Just is serving cultured chicken nuggets at quote unquote chicken nugget. I don't want you to get mad at me. Chicken nuggets in Singapore.
No, you actually wrote at one point in the book, because I wrote it down. You did write at one point, let's not call it chicken if it's not chicken. And I don't think you were quoting somebody. That was you saying that.
Yeah, terminology is going to be so tricky. It's just, I don't think we're going to get there. It's like the non-animal whey protein.
Yeah.
Right. That's terrible. I don't want that. That can't be where they land.
That's certainly not appetizing.
No. And it's on an ingredient list, and my friend bought the ice cream that included non-animal whey protein. Right. And she texted me and she said, this is dairy. Yeah. I was like, yeah, it's dairy. It doesn't have lactose, if that helps, but it's still cow protein. So it's really confusing. So I don't see them coming up with words as creative as tofu and tempeh, but this education component is going to be really tricky. But again, back to the Eat Just, which is serving chicken nuggets in Singapore, all they're telling people is that it's cultured chicken cells, and then it's some protein, some vegetable protein to round it out. And no one's asking.
Right.
So, while it's in the rarefied environments of fine dining, people aren't really asking like what farm it's from, and how were they like free range, right? People aren't asking that yet. But I'm hoping with my book, and I'm hoping that people will start asking these questions, and also like maybe we'll get back past the mimicry stage, where if they do create something entirely new that we haven't thought about, then they can come up with their own names. They can create whole new categories, and that could be exciting.
I think it's also going to depend on who these companies define as being their primary target audience, right? Are they targeting, is their sweet spot the people who are, for whom this is not a big leap, or are they going for the
They want
people?
you. They want meat
Yeah,
eaters.
well, and I'm, it's funny. My daughter has a friend of hers who's vegan, and my daughter is a carnivore, right? I mean, she, there's nothing better for her than a steak, a beef steak, and her friend is always bringing over vegan ice cream and vegan cookies and stuff like that. My daughter's like, I'm not touching. I'll actually eat it. I mean, because I'll try it and I'll say, oh, this is pretty good. But I think that, but convincing. I think that if they decide that people like my daughter, who's in her 20s, they've got to figure out how to convert her. That's an entirely different challenge. Hey, a quick question. You mentioned Dan Barber before. One of the things that he said in the book, when you quoted him, is saying, he said, if you think vertical farms and impossible foods are the answer, you're on the wrong track. What did he mean by that? Because I think of him as being somebody who's pretty influential in the food business, with both his seed business as well as his restaurants.
Dan is, I love his voice. He's so, I think it's so important. And he's only looking at the soil and, farms and what we can grow and what we can grow better to be more delicious and more flavorful. He is all about the best possible end product. So in his mind, recreating a burger from one of his cows versus the Impossible Burger that's made from 15 ingredients that include, binders and gels and gums and a GMO ingredient called heme that is for flavor and color. He's like, that's not our path. That's not what's going to save us. And Dan's looking at the climate too. He is a fine dining chef, but he has a big voice. His book, The Third Plate, is amazing. And his seeds are, exciting to see a small seed grower coming out versus just big commodity seed companies. And what I see is, let's invest in people like Dan, in ideas that Dan has, in the same way, in the same amounts that we're investing in cultured meat, so that it isn't like one solution.
Right.
Don't turn, yesterday, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp were down because one company owns it and they're idiots, right? Let's not invest in one company. Let's not have 5 meat companies that make our meat. Let's not have 3 companies that provide our texting abilities. Let's not have one social media platform. Let's have more.
So there's room in the world for both that absolutely great tomato that's just a tomato, but that's been grown organically in great soil, and there's room for that, as well as something that has been developed a different way that might be more sustainable, or be equally as sustainable, but also might feed more people or whatever it happens. In other words, there's room for both tracks.
We need complementary solutions, and we need local solutions. We don't need the mega companies. I don't crave a world where Impossible Burger has the only burger being sold everywhere. I want 50 companies selling, meat type products to their regions. Like, let's make things regionally appropriate. Let's solve for where we know. If Pat Brown is a white man that went to worked at Stanford, that taught at Stanford, and is, brilliant, let's have him focus on, the US or the areas he knows. But like, instead they want global domination kind of instantly. But let's get regional solutions.
You do make the point at one point in the book that big food and new food are not the same thing, right?
They aren't yet.
Well, that was sort of what that was where I was going with that, right? Which is that they're not yet. But let's face it, when venture capitalists get involved, they're not doing it because they want to make a little profit. They want to do it because they want the big killing. And if the big killing is selling it to
China,
China, or to Kraft, or to whoever, or Philip Morris, because Philip Morris wants to diversify, that's the move they're going to make. Yeah. And so that's to me a real danger in some of what's going on.
Absolutely. Big food is paying attention. They're paying attention. They're investing. They're acquiring. There are plant-based companies on the market right now that are already owned by big companies.
Yeah.
Nestle bought Sweet Earth. It's unavoidable. And so again, it's this like American diet layered on with like the new innovative version of the American diet. And that's where someone like Dan could come in and be like, no, 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 no. Like, let's rethink our American diet. Like we can't all eat like we would if we went to Blue Hill every day, but let's figure out
couldn't
how
afford it. For one
I definitely can't.
Okay, so two final questions. One is what's the thing that you saw, if there is one, that hasn't gotten traction yet, but when you saw it and had it described to you, you said, all right, I think that might have legs going forward. I think that might be the next hot thing.
I think my first two chapters, algae and mycelium, are the areas I'm most excited about. And they're the areas that algae still isn't anywhere realistic other than like, seaweed in the sushi restaurants, seaweed snacks, which is macroalgae, but microalgae, which is a great source of protein, has so much potential, but no one's really figured it out. There's a company in Berkeley that's making bacon from protein extracted from red seaweed, which is very good, very delicious, and is exciting, but it's challenging. So I want someone to figure out how to use algae and how to use it well, because I think it can translate all over the world in kind of really compelling ways, and it's good for us. And then mycelium, which is fungi, it's the root structure underneath the ground, and mushrooms are the fruiting bodies. Mycelium can be grown to be chicken, a piece of chicken. It could be grown to be bacon. It can be grown to be a steak. I've tasted them in all these iterations, and Meaty is one of the companies doing this, but there are others, not a lot. So it's still, and there's still a lot of what investors would call white space. There's still room to get in. And I think that there's a lot of potential. The ingredient list is clean. It doesn't need a lot of post-processing. Post-processing is like flavoring, adding more ingredients, kind of developing it in a co-packer kind of situation. It doesn't need a lot to already be a great source of protein with a little fiber, a little carbohydrate. So it's like a really good nutritional return on what you're looking to eat.
Last question. So your last chapter in the book basically asks lots of different food experts, both people who are in the food business as well as venture capital people, what they think people are going to be eating in 20 years. But let me adjust the question slightly for you, which is, what do you think the supermarket is going to look like in 20 years? How do you think everything you're seeing and writing about is going to change what that shopping experience, or at least what we find in that shopping experience, how will that be different 20 years from now?
Well, we could look at the dairy aisle as sort of an example of what it will look like, because the dairy aisle already has gotten real confusing, right? You have to when I go to Whole Foods or when I go to my local, it's called the Good Earth, and I start looking for my, non-dairy creamer or my butter that's maybe not butter. I'm like, wait, which section am I in? Am I in the real dairy, or am I in the alternative dairy? Am I in the hybrid dairy? So it's already complicated, but if nothing changes, 20 years is like, maybe we don't have water. maybe there's been some big changes, right? We haven't talked about like environmental catastrophes, right? Which could very well come. I don't want to be a doomsdayer, but if the markets don't change, if they look like they look now, it's just confusing. And I'm a super shopper, right? I know what I'm looking for and I know where to go, but I still don't know how to find and target like the dairy that I'm looking for. So I think we're going to see a hybrid, right? They're going to see, it could very well take 10 to 20 years for cultured meat to really make it into the market, to be cheap enough to be sold there. Or maybe there's like a fancy little fridge off to the side that has cultured meat in it. But I think it'll be like, because there's already data that says that alternatives sell better when they're next to the real thing.
Right.
So we already know that. So I don't see it changing. I don't see them creating a different supermarket, which might be nice, right? If supermarkets went smaller and became like, there's an organic supermarket and there was a cultured supermarket, and maybe over here there's a vegan supermarket, like that might be pretty cool. We've got websites like that already that are doing that. So it could be that we have very few brick and mortar stores. So the question is, Will our shopping patterns stay the same? If everything stays the same, it'll just be a confusing supermarket with lots of options. But I think something bigger will happen before that.
Well, and at the end of the day, when you describe that, even in the dairy aisle, what they need to do, right, is tell a better story and a more complete story. And in the meat department, if they're going to sell alternative meat or cultured meat, it seems to me one of the things they have to do is not just put it in a cooler right next to it. They need to take it out. They need to sample it. They need to be aggressive at selling the experience and explaining the advantages. Because if they do that, they can create a market, right?
Yeah.
They just stick it on the shelf and hope people understand. That's probably not the best way to go.
I mean, all the food companies are sad that sampling doesn't exist right now. And so let's just hope sampling actually comes back, right? Fancy Food Show was canceled in September. Let's hope that comes back.
Well, the pandemic can't last forever, can it? I don't know. I'm wondering. Listen, thank you so much for doing that. Let me hold up the book again. It's called Technically Food, Inside Silicon Valley's Mission to Change What We Eat. It's Larissa Zimberoff. I will put links down below so you can figure out where to buy it. Larissa, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. I wish you good luck, and I hope you'll come back on sometime down the road and talk more about this subject. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I loved arguing with you, Kevin, and I hope we can do it again.
That wasn't an argument. That was just a friendly discussion.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it was great.
Take care. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kevin.